Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Samech Vav. A new Mishnah. Hamchalel HaShabbat bedabar shechayavin al zidono karet v'al shigigato chatat. The context of the Mishnah is a list of crimes for which one is liable to stoning. And so the next one on the list is someone who violates Shabbat. Mechalel literally comes from to make hol, opposite of Kodesh. Shabbat is supposed to be holy. If someone makes it not sacred, secular, Mechalel Shabbat, and then he is liable to stoning. However, not every violation of Shabbat is liable to stoning. Most of them are, only if it's something that, if you did it on purpose, you would get karet. That means without witnesses, right? Let's say there's no witnesses or no warning, so you can't put the person to death. Then they get karet. And it's something that, if you did it bishogeg, you didn't realize today was Shabbat, you thought it was Tuesday, or you didn't know that cooking eggs on Shabbat is prohibited. So then that's shegaga, and one has to bring a sin offering. These go together. Things that for which you'd get liability of karet if it's on purpose, you get a sin offering if it's shogeg. Only prohibitions of Shabbat that qualify under this category, would it be true that if you did it in front of witnesses with a warning, then one would be liable to stoning. However, there are other violations that are prohibited from the Torah and yet do not have these criteria. They would not get karet, and therefore, if you do it even with witnesses, one would not get the death penalty. So that's what the Gemara asks. What are these other things? If the Mishnah has to say you only get stoned for certain things but not other things, that means there is something that is called Chilul Shabbat mideoraita, and yet you would, if you did it by mistake, you would not have to bring a sin offering. These are less severe, and you would not get karet if it was on purpose and without a warning. Maihi, what are these prohibitions? There's two answers. Techumin ve'alibad Rabbi Akiva, hab'ara ve'alibad Rabbi Yoseh. Techum Shabbat means you can't go outside of the city that you're in when Shabbat starts. You can't travel outside of it more than 2,000 amot. This is a prohibition. The question is it derabanan or deoraita? Other sages say it's derabanan. However, Rabbi Akiva says it's deoraita. It's not included in one of the 39 melachot. You can derive it from that lo yatzei ish mimekomo, do not leave your place. So other sages say it's Rabbanan. Rabbi Akiva says it's Deoraita. But it's not one of the 39 melachot. It's not an Av. It's not a Tolada. It is prohibited Mideoraita, according to Rabbi Akiva, but not punishable. And so this is something that you wouldn't get the death penalty, you wouldn't get karet, you wouldn't get a sin offering. It's simply a lav. And the other example is burning a fire, lighting a fire on Shabbat, according to Rabbi Yoseh. The pasuk goes out of its way. The Torah says many times, don't do melacha. Okay, so we have to figure out what all the melachot are. So there's different ways of deriving the 39 melachot. But then the Torah goes out of its way to say, Lo teva'aru esh bechol moshe botechem beyom HaShabbat. Don't kindle a fire. Why do you have to make a pasuk special for that? Rabbi Yosef says it's special to say that while other melachot of Shabbat, one would get a punishment of stoning or karet or sin offering for havara. The Torah singles that one out to say that there's no punishment for this. And so therefore, because it's singled out, is not liable to karet or sin offering, and one would not get the death penalty, but rather this is a lav. If it's simply a lav, according to Rabbi Akiva, tichumin, according to Rabbi Yoseh havara, simply a lav, if one violates it, it would be punishable by lashes if it's done on purpose, but not by death penalty. Next Mishnah, Hamkalel abi ve'imo eno chayav ad sheyikalelem b'shem. If someone curses his father or his mother, one is also would be liable to stoning. However, he's only liable to stoning if he uses Hashem's name, Yod Ke Vav Ke, and uses that name and curses either his father or his mother. What if he uses a different name, Kelam Bekinui, and the other name of God? Then machloket. Rabbi Meir mechayev. Chachamim potrim. Rabbi Meir says even there he's liable to stoning. Chachamim, however, say no. Chachamim say is Tanakama. You have to use only Hashem's special name. And if you use any other name, while it's not allowed, but that would not be liable to the death penalty. Man Chachamim. Who was the author of this? Who is the Chachamim? Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yosef. Who? De Tanya. Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yosef Omer. We have a Braita that quotes Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yosef saying the same thing. So he is therefore what's called Chachamim. When the Mishnah says Chachamim, it's not necessarily true that this is all the sages who were in the same room and made a vote and they all agreed except for the Meir, but rather sometimes it's actually an individual opinion. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he compiled the Mishnah, he thought that halacha should follow that opinion. And so this was actually a great honor to take off his name and to say that this represents the opinion that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks should be the halacha, and so he presents the minority opinion as Chachamim, and that's how we know that this is the one that he decided should be the psak halacha. Anyway, in the Braita, it quotes a pasuk, "Benokbo Shem Yumat." Ma'atomo domar Shem limedam kalel avi ve'imo sheno chayav ad sheyikalelem b'Shem. He's quoting this following pasuk that actually is not in the context of cursing a father and mother, but rather is in the context of cursing God. It says, "Ishishki kalel Elohav v'nasach chet'o." That's one pasuk. Anyone who curses his God shall bear sin. And it continues, "V'nokeb Shem Adonai mot yumat ragom yirgemu bo kol ha'eda kager ka'ezrach benok bo Shem yumat." You see, there's repetition. It starts off with "V'nokeb Shem Hashem." Someone who blasphemes, he will get the death penalty by stoning. And then it ends also, Benok Boshem, when he blasphemes God, he will die. Well, this is extra. What do we need this for? You already said, Nokeb Shem Hashem. Why do we need this Shem? Obviously, it sits extra here. So we apply the rule that if the Torah mentions something in one place, but it's not necessary for that place, then it's extra, and we can apply it to a different context. And so that's exactly what we're doing. What is this teaching? We're applying it to a different context, not cursing God, but rather cursing a father or mother. And it says the word Beshem, Nokbo Shem, only if you use God's name, then one is liable to the death penalty. All right, now while we're on the subject, we quote another Braita about it. Tanu Rabbanan, Ish. This is quoting not the same pasuk, but rather this pasuk in Vayikra 20. That says, Ki ish asher yekalel et abiv ve'et imo, mot yumat, abiv ve'imo kilel, tamav bo. If someone, we're going to ask about this repetition, ish, who curses father, does this mean father and mother? Does he have to curse both of them, or one or the only, or the other, mot yumat, and then there is a repetition, abiv ve'imo kilel. Notice that over here it says kilel, before aviv, ve'imo, and over here it says aviv ve'imo, same order, but this says kilel afterwards. That's going to be important in a second. So back to the Braita. It says ish. Okay, fine. I know that a man cannot curse his father or mother. Matomodamad ish. Why the double language of a man? Lerabot bat tumtum vandroginos. That comes to include a daughter. Not only men, but also women are included in this prohibition. Daughter, adult daughter, if who curses their father or mother, will also get the death penalty. And not only someone who's clearly a man or clearly a woman, but also a tumtum whose gender is not determined, it's covered over and you can't tell, or someone who has both organs, hermaphrodite, even though they're not clearly an ish or isha, they also, if they curse their father or mother, they would also get the death penalty. They're still a child of someone. Asher yikalel et aviv ve'et imo, en li el aviv ve'imo. Aviv shelo imo, imo shelo aviv, minayin. So if I just have these words, it sounds like someone who curses his father and his mother. So I would think that someone only gets the death penalty if he curses both. But what if he curses his father is not his mother, or his mother but not his father? How do I know that that person also gets the death penalty? Talmud Omar, aviv imo kilel damav bo, aviv kilel imo kilel. Dibre Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia says we learn it from the repetition at the second half of the pasuk, where it says the same law, and this time it moves the verb kilel. So beforehand in the first half of the pasuk it says kilel next to father, and second half pasuk longer says kilel next to mother. And so we learn from that if one curses the father or the mother, even if not both, one still gets a death penalty. That's Rabbi Yoshia's derivation. Rabbi Yonatan agrees with the law, but he derives it in a different way. Rabbi Yonatan says, indeed, it is ambiguous. When it says father and mother, the vav in Hebrew can mean and, it can mean or also. So it could mean both of them, you have to curse both of them. It could mean only one of them. So how will we decide? Well, in other places, when the Torah wants to say both, it says yachdav. It says this and that, yachdav, together. So if the Torah wanted to say that one only gets the death penalty for cursing father and mother together, it would have added the word aviv et imo yachdav. If it doesn't say yachdav, that means either or. So also just one of them. So Rabbi Yonatan actually doesn't need the full pasuk. He's going to learn something else from the second half of the pasuk later on in the Masechet. Mot yumat biskila. Tamer biskila eno ela be'achat mikol mitot hamurot b'Torah. This pasuk says that someone who curses his father or mother will get the death penalty. So Midrash proposes it should be by stoning. Is that true? Is it stoning, or maybe one of the other types of capital punishment? Doesn't say explicitly in this pasuk. Well, it says here that his blood will be upon him, and it says regarding the oven yideoni that their blood will be upon them. And there it says explicitly that's sikila. We saw that on the previous stuff. So we make a gezer hashava, and that's how we know that someone who curses one of his parents also gets sikila. Okay, now we know the punishment, but we also have to have a warning. Just like in real life, you have to give a warning to someone and only then punish him. So to the Torah, it has to have two pasukim about something. It has to give a warning pasuk and then also a pasuk about the punishment. So we got the punishment. Where's the warning? Talmud Omar Elohim lo tekalel. We're going to learn this from Parashat Hashavua, Parashat Mishpatim, that says one cannot curse. The word Elohim here, we're going to see, does it refer to God or does it refer to a judge? Right now we're assuming it's referring to a judge. So it says that one cannot curse a judge. Imaya aviv dayan, hareho bichlal Elohim lo tekalel. Imaya aviv nasi, hareho bichlal v'nasi be'amecha lo ta'or. So if his father was a judge, well then that would be included in the prohibition of Elohim lo tekalel. And then the continuation of the pasuk says nasi. So if his father was a nasi it can mean a leader, the political leader. So when at the time when we had a monarchy would refer to the king. So we'll just say it refers to the king or whatever other political leader there is. So pasuk says that one cannot curse a king. So if his father happens to be the king, then that will be included also. But what if his father is neither a judge nor the king? Eno lo dayan velo nasi minayin amarta. I know we can learn a precedent, a paradigm from both of them together. Sometimes if you just say one thing, well, sometimes even one thing can be a paradigm. It just gives one example, but we can learn the other example. Sometimes two things can be a paradigm if they're different. And here we see, Lo re'i nasi kere'i dayan, ve'lo re'i dayan kere'i nasi. The judge and the king are different. They have different laws that apply to each of them. Lo re'i dayan kere'i nasi share dayan ata misuveh al hora'ato, kere'i nasi she'i ata misuveh al hora'ato. A judge is different from a king because a judge, you are commanded to obey his halachic rulings. If someone goes against a judge, we can call that person a zaken mamreh. If he's an elder and he goes against the Sanhedrin, he actually gets the death penalty. So you have to listen to the halachic rulings of a judge who's in charge of an expert in halacha. That's not the same as a king, where you don't have to follow the halachic rulings of a king. A king is involved in political things, but he's not necessarily a halachic expert. So there's no problem, there's no sin of zaken mamreh that applies to a judge, not a king. So that has its own characteristic. And a judge is not the same as a king, because a king, you have a commandment not to rebel against him. If the king gives an executive order, he says, oh, we're going to war, or whatever it is, you have to pay tax, then you have to listen to him. And that's not the same as a judge, because a judge doesn't make political leaders. If a judge decides a political decision, you don't have to listen to the judge, but you do have to listen to the king. So they both have authority, but their authority is different, and the prohibitions against violating their authority are also different. So because they're different, so we can see that the prohibition against cursing them is not dependent just on the fact that they're a halachic ruler or because they're a political ruler, right? So these happen to be factors that happen to be this or that. But since they have in common that you can't curse either of them, it can't be because of only one of this factor or only that factor. So what's the common denominator between them? Oh, they're part of your nation. They're part of the Jewish people. Yeah, a king has to be part of the Jewish people, and so too a judge. And these two, it says you can't curse. Therefore, I can include a father. Really, you can include any Jew, right? Because this has the same common denominator. But that would include also your father, that he's part of your nation. Therefore, this is the warning about cursing your father we can learn from this common denominator. And now we ask, hold on, they have another common denominator in that they are both very prominent people. So maybe the prohibition of cursing only applies to very prominent people, leaders of the nation, political leader or judicial leader, but maybe only them, and not to a common person like the father if he's not a prominent leader. So maybe that's the common denominator, not just that they happen to be part of the Jewish nation. Oh, but there's another prohibition not to curse a deaf person. The point of this prohibition is even though the person is deaf and they won't hear it, and so if you curse someone who can hear it, they're going to make them feel bad. A person who's deaf, he won't hear it, so he won't feel bad. Still, you're not allowed to do so. And now a deaf person is a more humble person he's not exalted and in charge like the leaders. He's a humble person, and you're still not allowed to curse that person. So can't we learn from there that it's not only an exalted person, but even a humble person you're not allowed to curse. So that would include then everybody, right? Well, you could say no, maybe the humble person, the deaf person, it's precisely because he's deaf. That's why you can't curse him. He can't defend himself and yell at you back. But someone who's not deaf, maybe you wouldn't have a prohibition. It's not a nice thing to do, but there wouldn't be a specific prohibition. You can curse a person who hears, and because then you'll be embarrassed, or he'll take it back. He'll make you take it back, and he'll make you apologize. Not so for a deaf person. So maybe there's a special law regarding a deaf person. Nasiv dayan yochichu ma'ale nasiv dayan sheken gidulatan gamar lehen cheresh yochiach. So, but if we had, you're right. If we had only a pasuk about a deaf person, we would say only him. But the fact that we have a law also about a king and a judge, they can prove they can hear, and so that proves that's not only because he's a deaf person. So that shows that the category is expanded beyond just a deaf person. But then you'll ask, and Nasi and the Dayan, they're prominent people. That's why it's very bad if everybody curses the leader, then it's going to cause the leadership to collapse, and people won't have respect for the judge and the king. So maybe that's why. But that can't be the only reason, because we also have a deaf person who's not a leader. So what do all three have in common? Each one has a specific characteristic. But what's the common denominator from which we can extract that anyone who has that common denominator, the law would apply to? They're all part of your nation. So they're all part of the Jewish nation, and you're not allowed to curse them. So too your father, and indeed any Jew who is part of your nation, you have a warning not to curse them. So that's where the warning comes from. But then we ask further, yeah, but these three, they all have some aspect of them that are unusual. This one is prominent judicial, this was a prominent king, this one is a deaf person, so they all have an unusual factor. So maybe it doesn't apply to just a common person that doesn't have anything unusual. אלא אם כן, נכתוב קראו אלוהים וחירש, או נשיא וחירש, אלוהים למלי, אם אינו עניין לגופו, אינו עניין לאביו. Okay, you know what? You're right. We accept this argument, so we're going to revise it and say, listen, if the Torah only wanted to say that you can't curse someone who has an unusual feature, then it would have been sufficient to have just two pisukim. Either that you can't curse a judge and a deaf person, or a king and a deaf person. And I could learn one from the other. If it just said a judge and a deaf person, a judge, oh, he's prominent. Okay, anyone else who's prominent, you can't curse. And a deaf person who's very humble and can't hear, also you can't curse. And I would know that you can't curse a king also. Or if you just had a king and a deaf person, I would know deaf person because he's deaf and the king because he's prominent, and that would include also a judge. So I only need one example of a prominent person. So one of them is extra. So the one that's extra, why do I need it? Oh, well, if it's not needed for its own context, where you apply this rule again, then we'll apply it to a different context. So I already know that humble people, like who's deaf, I can't curse. I already know an exalted person. The extra one is coming to include a father, and that's how we know that a warning that one cannot curse a father. We go on to the next step. Oh, this whole argument is fine according to the opinion that says the word Elohim lo tekalel, is a non-holy word. It's referring to a human judge and not to God. That makes sense. But there's another opinion that says that this pasuk and this word in this pasuk is actually Elokim and is referring to Hashem, and there's a prohibition of cursing Hashem. Detanya Elohim hol diber Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer Elohim kodesh. Here's the machloket. Rabbi Ishmael says the word Elohim is referring to a judge. That's why we could just call Elohim, and you could even write down this word. You can say it even out of context. Rabbi Akiva omer Elokim kodesh. If you're saying the whole pasuk, you can say it anyway. But here, if you're just saying it out of context, it's actually holy. Elokim. This is a holy word. It's referring to cursing Hashem. V'tanya Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov omer Azara le'mevarechet Hashem minayin tamod omar Elohim lo tekalel. And there's another braita according to which Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov teaches, where is there a warning against cursing Hashem from this pasuk Elohim lo tekalel? So you see, he also is treating it like a holy instance of Elokim, like Rabbi Akiva. So we answer simply, Leman damar Elohim chol, gamar kodesh mechol. Leman damar Elohim kodesh, gamrinan chol mikodesh. It doesn't really matter if you think that the word Elohim here is holy or not holy. If you say it's not holy, so then it will directly come to include a father. But then what about an azhara for the cursing of God? So we need an azara also for that. Well, we can learn the holy from the non-holy. I mean, if you can't curse a common person, then all the more so you can't curse God. And according to the Rabbi Akiva, who says that the word Elokim here is holy, so then it serves as a warning not to curse God. And we can learn from there, right? We can learn chol from kodesh, that just like you can't curse God, so too you cannot curse a father or other commoners. Okay, so that's a simple answer. But we ask about that. It makes sense according to the opinion that says that the word Elohim here is not sacred, and it means that you can't curse a human being. Well, then all the more so, Kavachomer, you can't curse God. That logic makes sense. But if you think it's referring to a holy name that you can't curse God, well then just because there's a prohibition of cursing God doesn't mean that there's a prohibition of cursing a human being. Dilma akodesh azhar achol lo azhar. Maybe the Torah comes to warn and say don't curse Hashem, but it doesn't say not to curse a human being. So that logic wouldn't make sense. The Kal Vachomer works one way, but not the other. And so we still have a question on that opinion. And our answer is, Im ken lichtob kera lo takel, my lo tekalel, shema mina tarte. If in fact it was only telling us, Elohim here is in fact holy. But if it was only teaching us that one cannot curse God, then it could have used a simpler form of the verb, lo takel. Don't treat God lightly by saying a curse. But how come Yoma says an extra lamed, lo tikalel. Oh, so we can learn from that extra letter another law that just not only is it prohibited from cursing Hashem, also it's prohibited from cursing a commoner Jewish person, including one's father. And so now we answered the question according to everybody. We know the punishment and the source of the punishment for cursing a father or mother, and we also have a source for the azhara, for the warning of the prohibition against cursing a father or mother, or indeed any other Jew. Next Mishnah, Haba al Na'ara ha-me'orasa, someone who has sexual relations with a Na'ara, meaning between 12 and 12 and a half, who is legally engaged to a man. If someone does that, then he also gets sikila. She would also, depending on whether she did it willingly by consent or against her will. Eno chayav ad sheteheh na'ara betula me'orasa v'hi bebet abiha. Ba'al ha'shenayim harishon b'skila v'hasheni b'chenek. One is not liable to stoning unless, number one, she has to be a na'ara, between 12 and 12 and a half. Second, she has to be a betula, meaning it has to be her first time engaging in sexual relations. If it's she was already with some other man, then the second guy would not get sikila, but a different punishment. Me'orasa, she has to be halachically engaged and not yet married. If he bet abiyan, she has to be still living in her father's house and not, we'll see, the Gemara will say, not on the way to her husband's house, meaning in the process of getting married. Now, the word betula here is going to be important because let's say there are two men that have relations with her, right? First one and then the second at some point later. So the first one will get sikila because the first one, all these criteria apply to him. She was a betula at that point. However, if a second guy comes and has relations with her, then she is no longer a betula. So then the second guy, still she's engaged to another man, so it still is adultery, but then he and she, if she did it willingly, would get the punishment, the standard punishment for adultery, like with a married woman, which would be chenek. There is a chidush here added in that will come up towards the end of the Gemara, that even if the first guy had relations with her shelo kedarka, from the back, in which case the bitulim are still intact. We learned earlier that relation shelot kedarka is legally considered a sexual act, and therefore any punishment that one would get with kedarka is true shelo kedarka, and therefore the first guy gets sikila. The second guy, even though she is still a betula, he would still get chenek because it's only her first time and not the second time that she sins. Let's look at the Pisukim from which we learn this, because this is they're going to come into context here in a minute. Ki hiya na'ara betula me'orasa le'ish umsaha ish ba'ir v'shachab ima. So in fact does say she has to be a betula and legally, halachically engaged to a man. And someone finds her in the city. Since they're in the city, she could scream out if she was against her will, and she doesn't. So that means it's consensual. So then you take both of them to the gates of the city and suskaltem. So here we see explicitly that it's stoning. Vametu hana'ara al-davar shelo sa'aka ba'ir. How can we kill her? Because she didn't cry out. If it was against her will, she needs to cry out, and someone would have heard her and found her and stopped it. And the man, because he has tortured and slept with someone else's wife, and you have to get rid of this evil. That's case number one. Later on, we're gonna make reference to the second case, so let's just read it now. If it's in the field where this happens, and a man finds her and grabs onto her, right? So that sounds like by force, and sleeps with her, then he alone dies and not her. In case you didn't get the point, that levado, only he dies. Don't do anything to the woman. She has no sin, because it's the same as a victim of murder. Right? When someone murders someone else, you only convict the murderer, not the murdered victim. Well, the murdered victim in that case would be dead anyway. But the point is that you only would give punishment to the perpetrator. And so in this case, since she's in the field and there's nobody around to hear her cry. So that's different from in the city. So the point is not specifically in the city or in the field, but the point is it consensual or not. So the man will get capital punishment either way, but the woman only if it's consensual, not if it's forced. All right, so now we turn to those Pesukim and we learn Tenor Banan, Na'ara velo bogeret. So the Pasuk, in fact, that we just read says she has to be a Na'ara, meaning between 12 and 12 and a half. Not exactly, it actually depends on physical signs of maturation. But if she's older, if she's 13, older or older than that, then she does not get then they do not get sikila, but rather would get hanik. Betula velo be'ola. She has to be a betula still, virgin, and not if she already had relations with someone, any kind of relations. Me'orasa velo nesua. She has to be only legally engaged and not yet fully married. If she's fully married, then again it's chenek. Bebet abiyah parat l'shem masad ha'av l'shluche ha'ba'al. And she's still living in her father's house. Well, usually when they're not yet married, then she's still living in her father's house. Once she goes into her husband's house, that's the definition of marriage. To be legally married in halacha, they don't have to physically consummate the marriage. The main part of marriage is the fact that the husband brings his kala into his home, into his marriage canopy, into the groom's home. And so once that's done, it's already nisuin. So what does it mean that she has to be in her father's house? This would exclude if the father handed his daughter over to the messengers of the husband. The husband, he's far away or he's busy, and so he doesn't come to pick her up himself, that he would usually do. He sends a messenger. So now she's no longer in her father's house, so she's on the way. And if she would commit this type of adultery at that point, then also they would not get sikila, but only chenek, because she's not in her father's house yet, even though she's not yet fully married, because she didn't reach the husband's house. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Zot Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rav Yehuda says the name of Rav that the Mishnah, and presumably also this Baraita that's expanding on the Mishnah, explaining its source, is only the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Hachamim omrim na'ara me'orasa afilu ketana b'mashma. Hachamim disagree on one point. They say that here when it says na'ara, that includes also someone who is younger, a child, also under 12. So in other words, according to the Rabbi Meir, one gets stoned only if she is between 12 and 12 and a half. If she's older than that, then it will be chenek. If she's younger than that, we'll see what happens. But the na'ara means only 12 and 12 and a half. It doesn't explicitly say that because it says lo bogeret, but the Rav's understanding, as according to Rabbi Meir, if she is younger than 12, also no stoning for anyone. However, Chachamim say that na'ara me'orasa, that comes to give the upper limit, that if she's older than na'ara, if she's 12 and a half, it was more than 12 and a half, then it would only be chenek. But when it says na'ara, it's any time under 12 and a half. If she was engaged to a man and she commits adultery, then the man will get stoned also. Now if she's under 12, will not get any punishment because she's a minor. And a minor is never going to get punished for any crime or sin that they do. Only if she's between 12 and a half, then she gets stoned also. But the point is that the man, the adulterer, will get stoned even if she is between 3 and 12 and a half. Amar le Rav Acha medivti l'Ravina. Mimai dematnitin Rabbi Meir hi lemeuta ketana name dilma Rabbanan hi ulmeuta bogeret vetula. So Rav Acha medivti asks Ravina, how do you know that how does Rav know that the Mishnah is following the opinion of Rabbi Meir and it's excluding a minor under 12? Maybe the Mishnah is Rabbanan and it's excluding only someone over 12 and a half, and that's it, because the Mishnah doesn't actually say anything about a ketana. It just says a ne'ara, and over here we explained it means not bogeret, but we didn't say anything about a ketana, so you can explain the words equally as being according to Chachamim. Good question. And Ravina responds, Amar le, hai, eno chayav ad shetehe na'ara betula me'orasa, eno chayav ela al na'ara betula me'orasa miba'ele, betula mide. He says, if the Mishnah was following the opinion of Rabbanan, that anyone under 12 and a half, he would get sikila, and then the Mishnah should have written one is not liable except for when the girl is ne'ara, and then you could have fit chachamim into that only if she is a ne'ara, and ne'ara means and not a bogeret, but ne'ara means anything ne'ara or younger would be included. That could fit if they have the word al, but the Mishnah doesn't say the word al, it says ad, until she is a ne'ara, and so this fits better with Rabbi Meir. One is not liable to stoning until she grows up somewhat and she becomes a ne'ara. So meaning when she's a ketana, then no, there is not a punishment of stoning. Only until, not al but ad, she is a ne'ara, and for how long? For all the time of Ne'ara, only between 12 and 12 and a half, but not younger and not older. So, in fact, you see that Rav was very careful and was looking exactly at the words, and Ad does mean that it's Rabbi Meir's opinion and not Chachamim. Ba'amine Rabbi Yaakov bar Ada merav ba'al kaketana me'orasa Rabbi Meir mahu legamre mam'itle o mesikila mam'itle. Rabbi Yaakov bar Ada asked Rav, after Rav already said that law, a follow-up question. What if you have a child, let's say 11, and she is legally engaged to a man, and someone commits adultery with her, another man. According to the Meir, what would be the law? When you say that she is excluded, is she excluded completely, and there would not be any capital punishment at all for the adulterer? Or do you mean he's excluded from the law of stoning? So he wouldn't get stoned, but he would get chenek, the standard punishment for adultery. And the Rav answers, no, it makes sense that he wouldn't get sikila, but he would get chenek, because he's still committing adultery against an engaged woman, and therefore he still deserves something, it's just not sikila. Okay, so that was Rav's answer. But now, a follow-up question against Rav. V'haketib umetu gam shenehem, ad shiu shenehem shavin, shatik Rav. But the pasuk that we read, this the first pasuk, when they are in the city, says that they will both die. And you can learn from the fact that it says they will both die, that the man only gets a punishment if the woman also gets a punishment, because it says both of them. And if she is under 12, she doesn't get a punishment. And so therefore, based on this darasha, if she's 11, a child, a minor, and doesn't get a punishment, then he should get no punishment either. So that's darasha. And Rav said, no, he doesn't get sikila, but he does get chenek. But then what are you going to do with this pasuk? And Rav was quiet. He had no answer to that. So Amar Shemuel, my tamashatik Rav. Shemuel says, I don't understand why Rav was quiet. He could have had an answer. From the second case of in the field, there it says if they're in the field and then he grabs hold of her, so then we assume that it's forced, it's rape, and in that case he dies only levado. Nothing happens to her, even if she's more than 12, because she is a victim and she was not a willing participant in the crime. So we see that there is a case where you kill him but not her. So this is a good answer for this pasuk that says gam shenehem. Okay, so now we have two pasukim. From the first case, when it's in the city, it sounds like you only kill him if you'd kill her. But from the second case when it's in the field, and we assume it's coerced, then you do kill him, but not her. So which one should we use as a precedent for when it's a child? Do we say, well, kill him without her, or that you can't kill him without her? And the answer is ketana'eh. This is a machloket tanaim, right? This argument here that Rav and Shmuel are having is explicitly argued by two Tanaim. Umetu gam shenehem ad shiyu shenehem shavim divrei Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonatan omer umet ha'ish asher shachab ima lebado. Since one pasuk says they should both die, it means that only if they both will be killed. That's what Rabbi Yoshia says. According to Rabbi Yoshia, he would presumably agree with the challenge to Rav that said that if she is a child and she therefore does not die, then he does not die either. That's Rabbi Yoshia. They both have to get the capital punishment. Rabbi Yonatan, however, says from the second pasuk that it says you kill him only in the case where it's coerced rape, so then he is killed only. And since you have a case like that, so we could apply that also to a child. For a child, it doesn't matter if the child is willing or not. It's just a child. Even if the child says that she is willing and doesn't put up a fight, since they're only a child, so that's considered also coerced against her will. And so in that case, just like a man who raped a 12 or 12 and a half year old, he would get killed and not her. So too, against a child, he would get killed and not her, according to Rabbi Yonatan. Okay, good. So now we see it's a machloket tanaim, but they both have sources. So what is each one going to do with the pasuk of the other? So ve'idach, we ask about Rabbi Yonatan. Ahi umetu gam shenehem ma'idad ishbeh. If you say that he gets killed only and not her, what is he going to learn from the pasuk that they both get killed? I mean, that's obvious if they both are adults over 12 and over 13 for the man and for the woman and the man, and they are consensual, then of course they should both get killed. What are you going to learn from this? Amar Rava chidudim. Rava says this comes to exclude from capital punishment if there's no sexual penetration. But maaseh chidudim means if they're just fooling around. If his male member is rubbing against her skin, so what's the difference? How do we learn that from Gam Shenehem? Because in the case of regular penetration, they are both getting a gratification. And so, since they're both getting gratification, Gam Shenehem, so then they both get capital punishment. However, in a case where he's just rubbing himself, and then he gets gratification, but she doesn't get any. So therefore, you don't apply Gam Shenehem. So without the Metu Gam Shenehem, I might have thought that even without a sexual act, if it's just rubbing, that they would get capital punishment. So this comes to teach Metu Gam Shenehem that only if they're doing an act where they both get gratification, which is penetration, then they get capital punishment. But if they're just fooling around, then there's no capital punishment. So that's what Rabbi Yonatan will use this pasuk for. Now, what about Rabbi Yoshia? Where is he going to learn that if there's just maaseh chidudim, then there's no capital punishment? V'idach maaseh chidudim lav kilum. He says maaseh chidudim, there's no act there. You never get capital punishment unless there's a physical sexual act of penetration. Just touching is not, even though it's prohibited, is not going to be a capital punishment. You don't need a pasuk to exclude that. Ve'idach hai lebado ma'idad ishbeh. And now we ask about Rabbi Yoshia, who said that they have to both be over 12. Otherwise, if it's a child, then just like she doesn't die, he doesn't die either. Well, what's he or Rabbi Yoshia going to do with the pasuk that says levado, that there is a case where he dies and not her, which is a case of rape? Why not apply that as a precedent for when it's a child? And the answer, what's he going to do with it? Because he doesn't use it for the child. So what will he learn from the word levado? It's obvious that you're not going to kill a victim of rape. כדתניא, באו עליה 10 בני אדם ועדיין היא בתולה. כולם בסקילה. רבי אומר, הראשון בסקילה וכולן בחנק. So he'll use it to learn the law that's mentioned in this baraita. Let's say you have a na'ara, me'orasa, this case, and 10 men have relations illegally with her. They're all 10 adulterers. And she is still a betula. How could that be? They're all shelo kedarka. So the first opinion, Tanakama says, they all get sikila because she is a betula. So even if it's many people, since she's a betula the whole time, they all this law of sikila applies to all of them because all the criteria. She is a na'ara, she is a betula, she is in her father's house, and so on. So therefore they all get sikila. However, the B, that's a biuda nasi, omer arishon b'sikila v'chulan b'chenek. Only the first one gets sikila, and the rest chenek. Even though the first one was shelo kedarka, and she's still a betula. Nevertheless, we're actually going to learn his derivation in a second. This law applies only to the first adulterer and not to the rest. And so, how do we know that? Oh, well, we can use this pasuk, levado, that only he, that doesn't mean only he as opposed to she, it means only he, meaning the first adulterer and not any of the others. And so that's what Rabbi Yoshia can do with that pasuk of levado. We next quote a baraita that brings a source for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's law that we just cited, Tenor Banan. Ubat ish kohen ki techel liznot, Rabbi omer techila. Vechen hu omer umet haish asher shachab imah lebado. This baraita is kind of cryptic, and we're actually going to see two interpretations of this first line. So he's quoting a pasuk that we've seen before, that if you have a daughter of a kohen, she has a special status because her father is holy, so she has a certain holiness. If she, is engaged or married and she commits adultery, then she has a law of serefa, not the usual chenek, but a higher level serefa. Now, literally, the word techel means to profane. She profaned her holy status and her father's holy status. So that's why her punishment is more than chenek, it's serefa. That's the usual interpretation. Rabbi, however, says techel doesn't come from chol, but rather techila, the first, meaning that, we'll see two interpretations in a second. And then it says, and also the pasuk that we just quoted, that if the man is with a nara me'orasa in the field, and that's rape, then only he dies. So he's comparing something about the first time that she has relations. If the first time that she has relations is by adultery, then she gets serefa, but otherwise not. And so that's similar to this over here, where it's na'ara, she has to be a betula. So in order to get stoning, in this case of na'ara ma'orasa, then it has to be also, she's a betula her first time and not a second time. So that's the correlation between them, but let's figure it out more exactly. Maika Amar Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua, Rabbi keRabbi Ishmael sebira le, de Amar arusa yasea lisrefa, velo nesua, v'achika Amar im betchilat bi'abiznut bisrefa, idach bechenek. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says Rabbi follows the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael, who says, we saw this machloket between Ishmael and others a while ago, and he says that this pasuk bat ish kohen applies to an arusa only if she's an arusa and she commits adultery, then she gets burnt. But if she's already nesuah, then she gets standard chenek. And how do you know that? From the word techel, and this is what it means. If techilat bi'ah, she is still a betula, she was not with any man, meaning she's an arusa. Then, and the first bi'ah she has is adulterous, then it's going to be serefa. However, if she's already married, and let's assume she consummated her marriage with her husband, so then she already had bi'ah. That's not techila anymore. It's still prohibited, it's still adultery, but it doesn't have the special law of ki techel, and therefore it's not serefa, but rather the standard punishment for adultery, which is chayanek. That's the first interpretation. Now we say, according to that, mai vechen. What's this vechen? Why are you comparing this bat ish kohen who has to be arusa? What's the connection between that and this law that says levado? Ki hatam. Ma hatam betchilat bi'ah kamishta'e kera, hachaname betchilat bi'ah kamishta'e kera. Oh, it's similar. Just like regarding the bat ish kohen, it's only the first time that she has bi'ah. If that's adulterous, that's what the pasuk is talking about, that she gets serefa. So too with the na'ara me'orasa, or regular, not bat kohen, regular na'ara me'orasa, it's only the first person that she has bi'ah with, the first adulterer, gets sikila, but the ones afterwards, even if she is a betula, nevertheless, by shelo kedarka, the first one is shelo kedarka, nevertheless, the special capital punishment of sikila applies only to the first adulterer and not to any of the others. So that's the similarity between the laws that we're deriving from these two pesukim. Amar le Rav Bevai bar Abaye, Mor la Amar Hachi Umanu Rav Yosef. So Rav Bevai bar Abaye says, my teacher did not teach it this way, does not explain the Braita in that way. Who's his teacher? Rav Yosef. And he said as follows, Rabbi ki Rabbi Meir sebira le damar niset le echad min pesulin mitata bechenek. Rabbi Meir said that if a bat kohen marries someone who she's not allowed to marry, like a mamzer, so she made herself whole, but she profaned herself by that marriage. And in that case, if she commits adultery, the marriage is still an effective marriage. Even a prohibited marriage is in between bat kohen and the mamzer, between a mamzer and any kosher person, although it's not allowed, it still is effectively a marriage, and therefore, if she commits adultery, that is going to be adultery. So her punishment would be only chenek. And how do you derive that from this pasuk? Actually, he's also reading techel as techila. V'hachi kamar im techilat achalataha biznut. Well, maybe kind of both. The first profaning, so it's bat ish kohen ki techel. The techel we're reading in two ways. So if what makes her profane first is her adultery, then she gets serefa. But if she already profaned herself in another way by marrying a mamzer, and then commits adultery, so the adultery is not what first profaned her. It's also a profanation, but it's not the first thing. So then she gets chenek. And so that's what we're learning from here. Also, we're interpreting it as first. I think they're also interpreting it as chulin. And so that's what it teaches. It's not teaching us what we said here before, that has to be only arusa. According to the B'Meir, it applies to, comes to exclude a bat kohen who enters into prohibited marriage, since she already became chol first, and not from the adultery first, and therefore she doesn't get serefa, but only chenek. Okay, now according to that, mai vechen, well, what's the connection? Because that is a particular law about bat kohen who marries a mamzer or someone she's not allowed to marry. That's a particular law. What's vechen? How does that compare to the law of nahara me'orasa? There's no comparison between this and that. For nahara me'orasa, it wouldn't matter if she's morasa to a mamzer, right? There's no vechen here, and the answer is, you're right, simana be'alma. It was just a mnemonic to say that there's some general similarity between these two laws of first techila this, and this one also is lebado. It's only one, the first guy, but it's just a general similarity. So as a mnemonic, he says vechen to remember both of these laws, but they're not really the same as they are according to the first explanation of this baraita. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen ve'amen.